introduce Dr. Stephanie Hampton. She's accomplished a lot. I had to write it down. So she got her bachelor's in environmental science at the University of Kansas, master's in biology at UNLV, her PhD in biology at Dartmouth College, where she studied the ecology of rotifers and other aquatic invertebrates with John Gilbert. She did an NSF bioinformatics postdoc with Daniel Schindler at the University of Washington. Then became assistant professor at the University of Idaho before she was tapped to be the deputy director of NCs at UC Santa Barbara, where you were for 7 years? 7 or 8. And she is currently the professor at the School of the Environment at Washington State, where she is also the director of the Center for Environmental Research, Education, and Outreach. So she's come all the way here from Eastern Washington to tell us about her latest research on Lake Baikal. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Roxanne. It's wonderful to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation. And thanks so much to everybody for coming out to listen to the seminar. This is I've been working on Lake Baikal for about 10 years, so it's gotten to the point, some of you can empathize with this, where it's gotten to the point where it's very hard to decide what to put into the seminar. And so I've got now lots of different research going on in Baikal, and I'm going to share with you some of our more recent results, at least partly because it's more fun for me to talk about some stuff that's pretty new, too. And like a lot of people of my career stage, I didn't start out to expecting to study climate change. I think it's more common among our graduate students and postdocs now that they're sort of getting into it, partly because they see climate change. And for me, it was because I was doing my postdoc at University of Washington and working with a long-term data set, doing statistical analysis with a long-term plankton data set, that the climate change signal was just evident. There was just no way to ignore it. That it was clear that I was studying climate change whether I intended to study it or not. And that's how I ended up having the opportunity to work at Lake Baikal. And I'm going to start out by telling you a bit about Lake Baikal, partly so that you understand what a special opportunity it is to study climate change, and also because a lot of what I do is really doing statistical modeling. And I think that doing statistics is best when you really understand the natural history of the system in which you're working. And so I want you to understand a bit more about the lake as well. Okay, so we can start out by saying, where is Lake Baikal? So it's very remote. It's in Siberia. It's quite large, so you can typically see it in satellite images. It covers 4 degrees of latitude, so that's about as long as Florida. It's about 5 time zones away from Moscow, and about half that to Vladivostok. So it's really a very remote place that is also quite large. So you'll frequently hear people talk about Lake Baikal as a lake of superlatives, that it's the most of everything. It's the world's deepest lake, so 1.7 kilometers deep, and it's a rift basin, so it's really roughly that depth through much of the lake. It's the world's highest volume lake, so you could say it's the largest. People at Superior will get mad because they have a larger area, right? So however you want to define it, it's got the highest volume, so it's got 20% of the world's liquid freshwater. So you could pour all of the North American Great Lakes into Lake Baikal. It's the world's oldest lake, so about 25 million years old. And that may be at least partly why it's also the most biologically diverse lake. So there's been plenty of time for speciation to occur in this lake. And the biota it's a real treasure trove for biologists. It's really fantastic. It's very cold. So my colleague Marianne takes her students out to Baikal in the summer. And they would typically have a contest where the students go in without wetsuits and see how long they can stay in. So it is, in the summertime, this is about 6 degrees C. So it's very, very cold. And it's a very steep-sided basin, so any of you who work on ships, that will jump right out at you when you look at this 75-foot cutter, just pulled right up to the shoreline, no dock needed, just veer on in, and that really is how we bring the boat around to most of the lake. We really don't use docks. So the stern of that boat is hanging over. Here it could be anywhere between 100 meters and 200 meters, the stern of that ship. So you want to be real careful when you step out to go wash your hair at the edge of the lake. But if you can tolerate the cold to put your face under the water, you will be rewarded because it looks very similar to marine environments. Sponge forests are quite common. And so some of you may know that there are freshwater sponges that are common throughout the world. They typically are sort of low-growing little sponges, but at Baikal they form these big branching forests that are very common, really, in Baikal within that nearshore zone. Another example of how Baikal frequently looks like the marine environment is a lot of the fishes actually resemble marine fishes. So this guy's closest relative is a freshwater sculpin that is very ecologically quite different and looks quite different. So this is what the Russians call a Golem yanka. And it's, I think, about 80% of the fish, the pelagic fish biomass, is of this little fatty fish called the Golem yanka, which is the primary food source of the top predator in the lake, Lake Baikal, the Baikal seal. And so for those of you who don't work on lakes and you don't know whether this is weird or not, I can confirm that this is weird. As a freshwater biologist, I never thought I would be in the situation to give research seminars where I showed slides of seals. But this is actually the top predator in the lake. So a pleasant surprise for me going to Lake Baikal was to find that it is quite a pristine, remote environment throughout much of the basin. So a lot of tourists, if you're in some of the towns where you can easily get there by rail, for example, you might not get that impression, but you have to remember this huge lake. And this is a largely roadless watershed. And so probably by virtue of just being inaccessible, it is pretty well protected and feels pretty pristine out there. So way out here in Siberia, at one of these villages that has no roads going to it, there is a biological research station that is run by the Siberian university called Irkutsk State University. And this is the same location that the Russian Academy has a limnological station as well. So it's this little, scientific village, more or less. This is Bolshia Kati. It's down here in the southern basin of the lake on the western shore. So you would get there only by boat, or in the winter, there's about 4 months of ice that you can traverse by truck as well. So there's only probably 100 people who stay here year-round, but the research station can be pretty active with Russian and international researchers in the summer. And it's out here in Bolshia Kati that in 1945, a Russian professor from Irkutsk State University started a monitoring program of the lake's plankton. So Mikhail Kozhov, his primary motivation, I believe, was just to understand fundamentals of plankton biology and understanding that Lake Baikal is a special place. And by learning more about the plankton in Baikal, he would learn more about plankton biology in other lakes as well. And so he started collecting samples several kilometers offshore every 2 weeks at depths ranging from 0, the surface, all the way down to 250 meters and below, counting all of the zooplankton to species and sometimes life stage as well, and the phytoplankton, and taking basic physical parameters. So he started that in 1945 and continued doing that every 2 weeks through the entire year. And so anything you've heard about Siberian winter is true. And so I want you to think for a second about sampling several kilometers offshore in Siberia through all seasons of the year. So his daughter, Olga Kozhova, also became a freshwater scientist and developed her own specialty and started working with him, collecting these samples along with other colleagues at the university. And ultimately, her daughter, my colleague, Lyubov Izmestcheva, also became a freshwater scientist and became a professor at the university and continued this work at the university along with several generations of other researchers at Irkutsk State University. So it's a real family legacy, and coming into Baikal research, really thinking of Baikal as the holy grail of freshwater biology. It's even more special when I feel that I'm sharing my colleagues' family legacy as well. And I think any researcher who has worked on Baikal will readily admit that they didn't know that this 60-year time series existed until we published this work on it. And so this data set was essentially unknown. It was not even very well known in the Russian literature until a total fluke, as these things happen, resulted in international discovery. And that's my colleague Marianne Moore at Wellesley College has been taking her students out to Baikal for some time. And she was listening to, or they had a researcher from the university who was giving a talk to the students, and it was going through translation, and the translator said 60-year data set, and Marianne thought, oh, that's probably just a translation error, and she didn't think anything of it. The next year she goes back, they said the same thing again, and she said, oh, excuse me. And that's really the story of how we started working there. So we started working with Lyubov Izmestcheva, my colleague, the granddaughter of Mikhail Kozhov, and asking her, okay, well, now we have this huge data set that we can all work with. Where do we start when we've got hundreds of time series? And she said, well, of course, what you do is you start with the plankton, because in a lake like Lake Baikal, temperature, it really drives everything. So you start with the temperature. And so that is where we started. Our Russian colleagues had told us certainly the lake is getting warmer, but we really don't know how much warmer it's getting. And any of you who have worked with time series know that seasonality is interesting, but it's actually kind of a nuisance when you're trying to figure out what the trend is. So we know that summers are warm and winters are cold, but what you really want to do is kind of get rid of that variation so that you can understand how much warmer is the lake getting over time. And so luckily there are lots of different time series techniques we can use to try to get at that question. And so the one that we use is a Fourier transform. And this is basically just a way to describe what the typical seasonality is, and then essentially to remove that seasonality and to analyze the residuals and say how much warmer is the lake getting given the seasonality that's already in the data. And it turns out there's all sorts of interesting stuff to say about the seasonality that turned into an entirely unexpected paper. But for now, I'll just stick with the trend. So fitting a single seasonality model to these data didn't work very well. As you might see, this time series was not stationary, so it required using a moving window approach where essentially we let that seasonal cycle vary throughout the time series. So you fit that seasonal cycle of Fourier to a window, you slide it along one time step, fit it again, and do this all along the way so that you're not necessarily studying the season itself. You're just saying, I know there's a season here, let's just get rid of it. And so that led us down a whole other pathway to interesting discoveries about the shape of the season over time. But ultimately, it did what we needed, and that was to remove that seasonal signal so that we could see what the trend was. And we were actually quite surprised to see how rapidly Lake Baikal was warming. And I think in my mind, certainly working on a lake that size, I just hadn't expected to see such a strong signal. And so it was warming at an average that is twice that of the average warming trend for the region, for Siberia, or the region right around Baikal, and that region is warming at twice the annual average air temperature globally. So really warming rapidly, and especially in the summer, that signal is very, very strong. And so the question that arises, of course, is why is the lake warming faster than air temperature, twice as fast as air temperature? So I don't know for sure on Lake Baikal, but at the time that we were wrapping this up, luckily Jay Austin and Steve Coleman were doing some similar work on Lake Superior, and these guys are more physical limnologists, and so that's the part that was really interesting to them. And they suggest that on Superior, it's the shorter duration of ice that leads to these temperature trends that are so much more rapid for the water than they are for air. And so the idea is that every day that you have ice cover, essentially you've got some insulation on the water, that the water under the ice is typically going to stay at 4 degrees. And so every day that ice is off of the lake is another day that it can be warmed, not only by the air, but also by solar radiation. And so this is how you can end up with such rapid warming rates for the lakes that do experience ice cover. And since then, I've done a fair amount of work now with a global database of lake temperatures, and this is one of the questions that keeps coming up for these ice-covered lakes, because we're seeing rapid warming trends in lots and lots of different ice-covered lakes worldwide. So ice in Baikal, ice is an important driver of ecology in any system where ice occurs, but in Baikal, it may be especially, the ecology may be especially sensitive to the ice, and that is because both the top of the food chain and the bottom of the food chain directly depend on the ice cover. So the Baikal seal pups on the ice, and the pups are raised in little ice and snow caves that help to protect them from predators until they can actually handle themselves in the water when the ice goes out. So they need a certain duration of the ice in order to survive. And adults actually also molt on top of the ice, and so the adults need for that ice to maintain until they're done molting as well. So the Russians who are studying the seals are also very concerned about the effects of shortening ice duration for the seals. But Baikal also has the bottom of the food web directly dependent on ice. And so this is not a picture from Baikal. I haven't done any ice diving, but this is a picture of the Antarctic sea ice from below, and it's got all this gorgeous algae hanging on the bottom of the ice, some of it directly attached, others suspended through convection right under the ice. And Baikal gets these massive algal blooms under the ice. And so I think when I first started studying Baikal, I thought that Baikal is probably very unusual in this respect, that it has such high primary productivity under the ice. As it turns out, this may be happening in lots and lots of lakes worldwide, and we're learning a lot from the sea ice community in how ecologically important this the ice-associated algae can be. Certainly in Baikal, it's really, really prominent. So that chlorophyll in some years can be twice that under the ice, twice what it is in the summertime. And this is mostly an endemic, the really big blooms are caused by, or are of, a endemic alga, a Lacacera baicalensis. So this used to be Melisira. And so this is why the Russians call these big blooms, or any Baikal researcher calls them the Melisira years. And they are really, it's a threshold that of about 10 cells per milliliter, where once the Lacacera is past that, it's way past that. So it's very, very obvious. You're in no doubt when there's a Melisira year happening, because all of a sudden these relatively large chains of Alakasera are really dominating the water column and create a real soup of algae under the ice. It's really fantastic. And so this has been a topic of great mystery at Baikal for decades, just decades. People have been obsessed with trying to understand what causes these huge blooms and exploring everything from population cycles of Alakasera to nutrient dynamics under the ice, to light conditions, to grazers, and even thinking about large-scale meteorological phenomena. So a great mystery with dozens of papers published on it in English, and so I can only imagine that there's much more published in Russian as well. So naturally, Alakasera baikalensis is well represented in this data set, so we have this fantastic opportunity to try to understand what are the factors associated with these Melisira years, these fantastic episodes of huge productivity under the ice. The first thing that we recognize looking at the Alakasera blooms is, first thing I wanted to know is, are they changing? We know that ice is getting shorter, and one of the things that you do see is that the timing of these blooms is getting later. So the ice is actually, it's coming on the lake later. So the time that it ends is, I think, is still roughly the same, or last time I looked at it, it's still roughly the same. But it's coming on later in the year. And you are seeing that the timing of these blooms is moving back later in the year as well. So we know there is some possibility for timing to be more affected as that ice gets shorter. But what are these factors that are associated with the blooms? I had been poking at this for years and years and years, and reading all the literature I could get my hands on about these Melisira blooms. And it seems like there's this trajectory where initially there were many, many hypotheses about what is causing these blooms, and ultimately more and more things started to point to the ice, and that it's the conditions of the ice. This picture I'm showing in the background is actual Baikal ice. It's really that, it's frequently, but not always that clear. So it can let lots and lots of light through it, which helps to fuel these blooms. And so ultimately, we were able to build a model that actually describes the blooms quite well. And there are many different ways to do this. But the one that we chose was essentially a logistic regression approach, where you're changing the Melisira bloom into just a binary response. Is it a bloom or is it not a bloom? So there's lots of different ways to do it. But these blooms are so apparent that it became actually a more tractable way to handle it. So that's what you're seeing here on the y-axis is just yes, bloom, no bloom. And then this red line is the probability of a bloom that's associated with that logistic regression model. And then the Melisira counts are over here. And I am sorry that you can't see it very well because there are little gray lines in the background. But essentially, we were able to build a model that does predict the blooms, which we were really excited about. And essentially, the blooms that are occurring in March or April are best predicted by the local meteorological and other physical conditions that occur back in November and December. And so this is at the time when the ice is starting to set up. And so water temperature, air temperature, a proxy for wind, which I could go into at great length. But essentially, wind data are really, really hard to find in remote regions of the world. But I think we have a good proxy, so telling us how windy or how stormy those conditions are in December, the snow depth, and also the Pacific decadal oscillation ends up in the best models as well, with sort of a gating function, which is interesting. But basically, these are telling us what are the conditions like. It's extremely cold, and it's not very windy, and it sets up clear ice that doesn't have those sort of laminations of snow and melty rain on top of it. And so essentially, we were finding the models that best describe the weather conditions that set up really clear ice really quickly. So it was cool. I mean, I had some, of course, I felt out of my depth in working on this project with this group of collaborators that was led by Steve Katz. But when we talked to ice scientists who looked at these data, he was like, oh, yeah, that's clear ice. I'm like, oh, I didn't know it's that easy. We should have brought you in sooner. But one of the cool things that happened in this, too, was that after we had built this model, we also had the opportunity to look at some of the later years of data. So this model was built from 51 to 97, and then the last 13 years of data were available at about the time the model was done. So we never even would have had a chance to peek at these data while we were building the model. And so we used the best model to predict those 13 new years, and we were able to predict Melisira years for 12 out of the 13 years. So clear ice, which was pretty exciting. So this is really important for all the productivity that occurs under the ice, and I think this is, as I said, is probably not just a Baikal thing. It's clearly not just a Baikal thing. There's much more happening under ice in lakes than has been previously recognized, and so I had been realizing that when I go to limnology meetings, more and more people are saying, I collected a little bit of data from winter, and I'm just seeing a lot more phytoplankton, a lot more zooplankton than I thought, and I'm starting to think we really need to get out there and start doing some winter sampling. It's a time of year that people have really ignored, except for some of those exceptional cases like Lake Baikal. And so, so seeing this movement afoot, we got together a bunch of researchers, not all in person, because it turns out that there were more than 100 people interested in this. So we built a collaboration to put together all of the data we could get our hands on for plankton under ice in lakes and try to describe some of those patterns. How much productivity, how much biomass, who's there, what are the typical patterns for winter compared to summer in lakes, so that can help to inform some of the winter research that people are excited to undertake right now. So that is what I was not very wisely working on last night until about 1 o'clock in the morning, because I'm on West Coast time. But we're done with that paper. So it'll be submitted pretty soon. And so, as you would expect, there's a lot going on under ice. It's exciting. But the summer is important too. I mean, I showed you the figures that the summertime temperatures are warming at a rate twice as fast as the average annual increases. So summer is definitely getting warmer. And in Baikal, that's really important, because these endemic species in Baikal are very cold tolerant and, in fact, intolerant of warmer temperatures as well. And certainly you see a lot of changes that seem to be occurring now. One of the things that is really striking is that you see in the long-term data that you probably wouldn't notice visually is that the chlorophyll has increased by about 300% in the summertime. So Baikal is stratified for very short time, about 6 weeks. It's a very weak stratification that's easily broken down. So you have this tiny little window of stratification, and in that window of stratification, chlorophyll has increased. And then a type of zooplankton that is not one of the endemic groups at Lake Baikal, the cladocerans, all of the cladocerans in Lake Baikal, crustacean zooplankton, these are all cosmopolitan. So it's not that they're invasive, it's just that they're found everywhere. And these are the guys that are really responding positively to these temperature increases in Baikal. And it's interesting, because they cycle nutrients differently. Fish respond to them differently than they do to the endemic copepods. So it could be some ecologically very interesting effects. Having said that, I mean, these are big numbers, right? 300%, it is a big change. It's a big change. But I don't think I've said this yet. It is ultra-oligotrophic. This is a lake where we don't have good long-term nutrient data, because the nutrients are below standard detection limits, and you're just not going to get that kind of long-term data from Baikal when the nutrients are so low. And so these chlorophyll, I mean, we're talking about going from 0.5 to 1.5 micrograms per liter. So it's still not very much, but it's obviously a big increase relative to those low levels. So that most of the work, I think all of the work that I've talked about so far is from the main station. This is that main sampling station that Mikhail Kozhov first started sampling in 1945. And it's just offshore from Bolshaya Kati on that southwestern shore. And as I've emphasized, probably enough already, it's a huge lake. And so our reviewers always ask us, and we always wonder, is it representative of the lake? Well, as you might imagine, our Russian colleagues are extraordinary. You're probably already getting that sense as well. And they actually have data from all over the lake. Each summer, during that short stratified period, they do the Circumbaikal cruise. And they've been doing it actually longer than 1977, but these are the years where we had the most cohesive data from, so that's what's represented in this study. So they go out to, I think, 69 stations that are sampled. There are more that are sometimes sampled, but that's mostly what's sampled. And it's all over the lake. Very intensive field season or excursion for them to take plankton samples and physical samples all over the lake. And this, again, my colleague, Leboeuf. And so Marianne did a tremendous, she did a tremendous amount of work to get these data into a format that could be readily analyzed. So that Station 1 data is actually pretty well organized, but these Circumbaikal data were more like, oh, and all the scattered files, and what does this mean, and what does that mean, and are these the same thing? So it was really on her back burner for many years that whenever she had an undergrad who she could put onto it, she would just keep trying to get these data all into a really robust format for analysis. And so ultimately, we got there. So we could ask these questions. Are changes happening all over the lake? And are they consistent with what we see at Station 1, where we've done the most work? So this map is just showing average temperature. And you can see it varies quite a lot. And that's what you would expect, right? I mean, 4 degrees of latitude, you certainly would expect that. And so temperature varies quite a lot over the lake. And then honestly, I was really shocked that the average temperature was, so this is in the summertime, and the average temperature increase was about twice what we had seen at Station 1 when you take the lake as a whole. So it was really strong temperature increases throughout the lake in the summertime, even stronger than what we saw at Station 1. That really surprised me. And of course, it could be that the time period is different as well. At any rate, it's a rapid warming trend when you look at the lake as a whole. And as you would expect in a lake this size, you also see that the average chlorophyll can vary quite a lot across the basins, which is one of the reasons that we were always concerned that Station 1 might not be as representative, because we knew that the ecology differed throughout these different basins. But consistent with what we had seen at Station 1, even though there's some variation across the lake, there's also this increase in chlorophyll of 46% over this time period from 77 to 2004. So chlorophyll increasing throughout the lake. Now, the first thing aquatic scientists would ask is this eutrophication? Is this nutrient pollution in the lake that could be driving it? And we don't have any evidence for nutrient pollution offshore. So there's been great paleolimnology work that's been done throughout the basins. This is one of the first international projects that happened after the wall came down. Was an international group of scientists did fantastic coring throughout Lake Baikal. And we don't see a signal of increased nutrient pollution in those cores. We don't see it in any other measurements we might have. But as I said, the nutrients are below standard detection limits, and of course, nutrients that are put into an oligotrophic system get scooped up really quickly by algae. So we can't say for sure, but some other researchers who have worked on phytoplankton in Baikal sense or have come to the conclusion that algal growth is frequently associated with warmer temperatures in Baikal and not necessarily directly with nutrients. But certainly could be a combination of both, and lots more to be explored in addition to the many other mysteries at Baikal. And so then among the zooplankton as well, we see some changes, and these are quite variable changes. So here, these little dots are the slopes. So over time, between 1977 and 2004, these dots represent the strength of the slope. And you see the endemic copepod, Epicura baicalensis, basically shows not much of a pattern. It's very variable throughout the lake, and we do have some genetic evidence that there are different populations of Epicura in the lake. So we might expect that there would also be some variabilities in these temporal patterns. The cladocerans are also variable, but in general increasing. And some of these changes are the strongest actually in the northern basin, where there's been the least amount of work in this very roadless watershed. So I guess the answers to our questions are essentially, yes, these changes are happening all over the lake, but Station 1 is not always, Station 1 meaning this main station in the southwest, is not always representative of these changes, and it actually appears to be underestimating some of those changes that are happening in Baikal. And this is particularly true in the nearshore areas. I mean, I've talked with a couple of people this morning. We've all lamented how little benthic monitoring there is in general. And in lakes, this is true with the littoral zones typically not being well monitored. And this, of course, is kind of crazy, because that is the place where humans most directly impact these ecosystems, and they're ecologically really important. And so recently, my Russian colleagues have also reported on some big periphyton blooms happening near shore, and of a type of periphyton that is cosmopolitan. It's not one of the cool endemics, but is making these really, really big mats near some of the human settlements. So there may be some localized sewage pollution in the nearshore environment as well. So that actually is research that's just been published in the past year. I wasn't going to go off on that, but I saw I might have another minute, so I did. So I can talk more about that, because I've been getting really interested in that. So this is all sort of on this topic of scaling up. I mean, we went from this main station where we've done a lot of work to looking at those circumbaikal data and patterns across the lake. And of course, what we want to know is, how does this fit into the big picture? And so I had an opportunity to get engaged in that in the past several years as a collaboration called the Global Lake Temperature Collaboration. I had to work through the acronym real quick. And so we just published this in December of this past year. And this is a combination, a synthesis of in situ data. So people out there actually collecting, putting their mercury thermometers in the water and their thermistors and taking temperature directly in the water, taking buoy data, and also satellite estimates of lake temperature. And putting those all together to try to understand what are the general warming trends, and what are some of the correlates with those warming trends as well. It's been quite a learning experience, and it's been really exciting. You know, one of the things that satellites can get you into is all the remote places that you can't go, or they're too dangerous to go, or just people don't go. The limitations of the satellite data are several. You know, one is that they only capture those big lakes. Another is that they only go back to 1985, whereas a lot of the hand-collected data go back much further. And frankly, we don't we don't know that much about how the satellite estimates of temperature from lake actually compare to in situ temperature. So certainly those studies have been done, but they've been done on relatively few systems. So each time we try to think about what they mean relative to the in situ data, we have to think through some lake-specific types of questions. But really an area of great promise. As you'll see, we did come up with a global average estimate of 0.34 degrees per decade of warming between 1985 and 2009. And some of the, the paper took quite a bit longer to write than we had expected, because we thought that some trends would jump out, like, oh, this region is warming faster than that region. And of course, this is why we're limnologists, is that it's all complicated and exciting and makes it fun. It's what makes it science, I guess, rather than just a puzzle. And it's really, the warming rates are associated with interactions between lake-specific characteristics, like morphology, how big, how deep is the lake, what's the surface area, and also the regional meteorological conditions. Because as I discovered in great depth during writing this paper, and many of you probably already know, it's not just that air temperatures are warming in these heterogeneous ways, but also solar radiation is changing around the world in heterogeneous ways that are not always lined up with the temperature. And solar radiation can be extremely important for these lake warming trends. So that's exciting work that also published a data set that is public, as in please get out there and use it. We invite more people to get involved and to use it however you want to use it. So there's much more about Baikal that I could talk about, but I hope I have left time for you to drive that conversation with your questions. Thanks. Yep.
In terms of the temperature structure, have there been any ongoing studies of vertical profiling of temperature to try and get an idea of the heat content of the lake, and whether the heat content is changing? And when you think about in the fall, as the temperature drops, as it gets more dense, there can be a lot of convection.
Yeah, those are really important questions. The short answer is yes, there has been some of that work. At the main sampling station for the university, the really long-term one, the samples are not, or the temperature measurements aren't taken at a high enough resolution to, say, where's the thermocline, for example. But there actually is there are finer scale temperature measurements for about 15 years down at Yanka. There's a what do you call them? The neutrino telescope down there, which apart from doing stuff with neutrinos, has also facilitated some basic limnological measurements like that. So it was about 15 years of work, but not anything I can recall off the top of my head that would actually answer your question, but the possibility is there.
Is it a rift valley?
Yeah.
Is there any geothermal sources?
There are. Yeah, so it has geothermal vents. And the water movement is really interesting in the lake. One of the special things about it, which is people think is partially why there's been such benthic speciation, is that it's oxygenated all the way to the bottom. And so this is associated with water that I think in the spring and in the fall sort of builds up at the edges of the lake and then plunges to the bottom of the lake and keeps the bottom oxygenated. So, certainly one of the changes that could happen with these temperature changes is that you don't get those. If you were not getting so much instability in that way, and so that you stopped that water from renewing in that way, that would be a tremendous effect on the biota. Yeah.
One of the big issues with time series is consistency of methods.
Yeah.
And things like standards and controls and stuff. And my sense of the Russian literature, at least into chemistry, that I saw when I was a student in SoMAS, which overlaps part of this time, is that they're not very good at that. The literature, at least, tends to skip over those kind of pesky details. So I'm just wondering how good the documentation is for things like, you know, are they measuring chlorophyll the same way? Are
Yep.
they measuring temperature the same way over this time series?
Yep. Yeah, when you first started, I knew you could have gone in either direction because people who work with taxonomy tend to think that the Russians are the most amazing taxonomists. And so I would say, you know, from all of the biological data, I think, are in really good shape because they've had the same plankton technicians working and have had good documentation of their methods. The temperature is still taken with a mercury thermometer in exactly the same way. So that's not been a big issue. And I think the chlorophyll, I think, is pretty well documented. But what you're talking about has been a problem for nutrients. And every time we have a paper reviewed, a reviewer says, "What? I can't believe there's no long-term nutrients. You need to know about nutrients." And so you look through the literature, and luckily, one of the Russian researchers there published a paper that reviews all of the nutrient data and says you can't rely on any of these nutrient data for exactly the reason that you're talking about. And she went through and just really dissected each study and said, this is not comparable, that's not believable, given this other thing. And so the nutrient data I'm certainly concerned about. I guess chlorophyll I'm a little less concerned about because my sense is that they really just measure things the same way. At least partly because technology doesn't change there very quickly because there's not a lot of money in science, or at least not in this kind of science there. So, but that part is more of a concern than the biological data for me. Yep. Yeah, Glenn.
I had a question about the life history of these zooplankton, especially the cladocerates in such a deep lake. Are they producing resting eggs? And if so, how do they act on?
I know. So the resting stages for the cladoceran, I wonder that too. So I really don't know the answer. In most long-term data sets, people will count resting stages, so you can usually look and see. And I don't recall a category for the resting stages, but I really just don't know. I mean, there could be horizontal transport for that particular station, but geez, yeah, I really don't know. I don't think that much is known. Yeah, it's a good area for more research.
At the delta, is it the Selenga?
Yeah.
You have saddle, it's a little shallower.
Yep.
You have, it looked like the most chlorophyll change, the biggest decrease in cladocerans. Is there any data on the river?
I think there are some data on the Selenga. I mean, because it's a big deal. But I don't have any of those data. But I know who I would ask about them.
Is it as oligotrophic as the lake?
No. The Selenga, but I don't know what the nutrient concentrations are. I mean, we certainly look at the Selenga for here's where sediment and nutrients are going to come in from the Selenga. I mean, it's running mostly through grazing land, and so and we know it's carrying a big load of sediments and probably contributes a fair amount of nutrients. But I don't know their fate. Who knows? I don't think we even know seasonally. When does the water, or how much of the water is floating and moving horizontally, how much is plunging, how much is lost to the depth before it becomes taken up into the photic zone. So yet another area for work. Yeah, that's a really cool system though. That it's called Academician's Ridge right there. Yeah, and it separates the central and the southern basin.
There's like 2,000 miles from the sea. How on earth did those, what I think of as marine mammal seals, get there? I mean, they obviously didn't migrate.
I always want to have a cheat sheet for the seals, because I work on plankton, but the seals are so interesting. I'm like, I need to know more about those darn seals. So this was a question of much debate. So my understanding is that they came down from Arctic Circle through river passages, but I can't remember how long ago. I apologize.
They're going upstream. If they come up a river from the sea, they'll be going upstream, and how on earth will they get into the lake?
Okay.
Nobody knows?
No, I actually think I think somebody has worked that out. I don't want to leave the sense that this is a big mystery, but it was a debate some time ago, and I think it's settled, but I'm going to admit that I don't know.
What do they eat?
They mostly eat the Golem yanka, that fatty little pelagic sculpin. So that's about like 80 or 90% of what they eat. Yeah, which is also interesting for those of you interested in pollutants, because Golem yanka are really fatty, and they also can be highly cannibalistic. It presents this great opportunity for some bioaccumulation. So, and that which would occur from atmospheric deposition largely. Any questions?
So if there are no more questions, or those that do have more questions, join the speaker for lunch. And thank you very much.
Yeah.
Target on my back.
I know.
Sometime in the last 6 months.
So sometime